June 6, 1944. Dawn broke gray and cold over the English Channel. The sea churned with hundreds of landing craft, small silhouettes rising and falling in rough surf. Inside one of them, 30 men crouched low, rifles clutched tight, faces pale from salt spray and fear. Their world was the metallic slam of waves against steel and the distant thunder of naval guns. Ahead lay Omaha Beach, a blur of smoke, sand, and fire. At the front, a young coxswain gripped the wheel, eyes locked on the shoreline. Orders were clear: get close, drop the ramp, let them run. But what he saw through the haze wasn't a beach. It was a killing ground. MG-42 tracers raked the waterline, cutting down men the instant ramps fell. He felt the instinct rise, defy the command, drop early. He shouted, and the ramp splashed into the sea far short of land. Men plunged into chest-deep water, gasping, crawling forward under the bullets that hissed where their heads should have been. Some cursed him, others never knew. But 30 men would live because one sailor disobeyed. That moment was born from chaos, and it began before the first ramp ever hit the sand. Before the ramp fell and the bullets tore through the surf, the plan for D-Day had been drawn with mathematical precision. Operation Overlord was the largest amphibious invasion in history, a masterpiece of coordination between land, sea, and air. Months of planning, deception, and sacrifice had led to this morning, June 6, 1944, when Allied forces would finally storm the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. The world waited on the outcome of this one gamble. By dawn, more than 5,000 ships covered the channel, their wakes stretching from England to the French coast. The assault force alone carried over 156,000 men. The objective was clear: establish a foothold in Normandy and begin the liberation of Western Europe. Each nation had its sector. The British targeted Gold and Sword, the Canadians Juno. But the Americans faced the most heavily defended, Omaha Beach, a 6-mile stretch of sand flanked by cliffs, minefields, and machine gun nests. The weather had already pushed the operation to its limits. High winds, heavy surf, and low visibility forced General Eisenhower to delay the invasion once. Now, on this morning, it was far from ideal. The gray skies and rough seas tested every landing craft, every man. The small wooden and steel boats known as Higgins Landing Craft, LCVPs, were tossed like toys in the cold waves. They were designed to deliver 30 soldiers directly onto the sand. No armor, no cover, just thin steel sides and a ramp that dropped straight into enemy fire. Each craft had a crew of 4, a coxswain to steer, an engineer to handle the motor, and 2 men for security. The coxswain's job was simple in words, but brutal in reality. Navigate through chaos, time the approach, and lower the ramp when close enough for the soldiers to wade or run ashore. Every decision rested on his eyes and instincts. The soldiers depended on him completely, though most never even saw his face. Inside the craft, men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions waited in silence. They were soaked, seasick, and freezing, packed shoulder to shoulder. Some tried to pray, others stared blankly at the ramp in front of them, the door between life and death. Many had been told that naval bombardment would neutralize the defenses. Few realized the truth. The German positions had survived almost untouched. Across the beach, the German 352nd Infantry Division watched the Armada approach. Their MG-42s were locked in place, zeroed on the most likely landing zones. Barbed wire, mines, and concrete bunkers lined the bluffs. They were veterans. Many had fought on the Eastern Front. They knew what would happen once the ramps opened. For the men in the landing craft, the noise was overwhelming. Artillery boomed from ships behind them, shells whistled overhead, and the sea hissed as bullets skipped across the surface. When the first wave approached, smoke and spray turned everything into confusion. The coxswains tried to stay in formation, but currents and wind scattered them. Some landed hundreds of yards off target. Some hit sandbars and stuck fast. The first ramps fell, and the machine guns opened. Whole platoons were cut down in seconds. Bullets tore through steel like paper. The men inside the boats had no protection. If the ramp dropped too early, they risked drowning under their gear. If it dropped too late, they'd die trapped inside. It was a cruel equation, measured in split seconds and instinct. Still, the coxswains pressed forward, steering through explosions and sinking craft. They were barely older than the soldiers they carried. Their names rarely appeared in reports, yet every survivor owed them his life. Some followed orders exactly. Others, in that chaos, made choices no manual could prepare them for. By 7:30 a.m., Omaha Beach had become a slaughter. The tide carried bodies, wreckage, and burning oil. Officers tried to reorganize the survivors hiding behind beach obstacles. The landing waves kept coming, one after another, each meeting the same fire. But amid the carnage, a pattern began to emerge. Some men reached cover, some didn't. The difference often came down to a single decision, when the ramp dropped. And in one landing craft, a young coxswain had seen enough through the smoke and fire to make a choice that would defy his orders and save 30 men. Omaha Beach stretched between Vierville-sur-Mer and Colleville, a long crescent of pale sand beneath steep bluffs. At low tide, the distance from waterline to cover could reach nearly 300 yards, an open killing field. Every inch had been measured by the German 352nd Infantry Division, whose engineers built interlocking fields of fire. Their positions were dug into concrete, invisible from the sea. MG-42s covered every exit, and mortars waited to strike at any sign of movement. For the Allies, this terrain was a nightmare. The plan called for infantry to land after heavy naval and aerial bombardments softened defenses. But by the time the first waves hit shore, the smoke from explosions had cleared, revealing German guns largely intact. Many naval shells had overshot, hitting empty fields behind the cliffs. The bunkers still stood. At 6:30 a.m., the first assault companies of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, began their approach. The Higgins boats bounced through choppy water, diesel fumes choking the air. Inside each, 30 soldiers from the 16th and 116th Infantry Regiments crouched low. Many were already seasick, drenched, and trembling. Above the roar of the engines, few could hear anything clearly. The coxswains could see what the men couldn't: tracers streaking from the bluffs, bursts of sand erupting from machine gun impacts, and plumes of water where shells landed nearby. Every instinct told them this was not going as planned. But training and command were absolute. Reach the beach, drop the ramp, and get out fast. To the right flank near Vierville, the 29th Infantry Division fought through heavy crossfire. To the east, near Colville, the 1st Division faced the same fate. Every boat that reached within range of the MG-42s became a floating coffin. The bullets hit the ramp first, then the men behind it. In some cases, entire groups were wiped out before they could take 2 steps. Survivors spoke of the water turning red, of equipment dragging wounded soldiers down into the waves. The Higgins boat, the simple craft carrying them, had been hailed as one of the war's most vital inventions. Andrew Higgins, a boat builder from New Orleans, had designed it for swamp and river landings. Its shallow draft allowed it to run up to shore, and its front ramp gave soldiers a fast exit. The U.S. Navy adopted it for amphibious assaults, and it became the backbone of Allied landings across the Pacific and Europe. Yet its strength, direct unloading, was also its greatest risk. In calm rehearsals, the ramp dropped smoothly onto sand. In real battle, it dropped into hell. The coxswain stood exposed at the rear, steering through surf, smoke, and chaos. He had seconds to judge when to lower. The ramp. Too far out, and the soldiers would drown. Too close, and they'd die under fire. There was no rule book for the reality of Omaha. By 7:45 a.m., confusion reigned. Landing craft from different regiments intermingled. Some boats missed their assigned sectors entirely. German artillery zeroed in on clusters of landing craft, turning the sea into a boiling graveyard. Still, waves of men came on. Behind them, destroyers moved dangerously close to shore to provide fire support, their guns firing point-blank into the bluffs. Among those countless boats was one that carried a small group of men from the 16th Infantry Regiment. Their coxswain, a young Navy sailor in his early 20s, had been on the water since before dawn. He'd already seen what happened when ramps dropped too close to shore. He'd seen other boats split open by gunfire, watched men fall before touching land. Now, steering through the smoke, he realized his own landing zone was directly under a German strongpoint. He felt the engine shudder as the boat hit a sandbar. The order replayed in his mind, get them as close as possible before lowering the ramp. But through the spray, he saw the arcs of machine gun fire cutting the surf ahead. There was no safety there. The closer he went, the more certain their deaths would be. He made his decision in an instant. Before anyone could react, he pulled the lever and dropped the ramp, too early, far from land. The soldiers cursed, thinking he'd lost his nerve, but then they saw the bullets rip through the space where they would have stood. The sea swallowed their complaints as they plunged into the water, alive. This moment would never appear in any official briefing, but that act, that instinct, would become a symbol of what Omaha truly was. Not a perfectly planned invasion, but thousands of moments of human choice under fire. Every invasion is built on plans and strategies, but in war, survival often depends on human instinct. The story of the coxswain who dropped his ramp early reveals more than one act of defiance. It opens a window into the chaos, fear, and courage that defined Omaha Beach. There were many layers to that single moment. Each tells us something about the men, the machines, and the madness of June 6, 1944. The human angle came first, the experience inside that cramped Higgins boat. 30 men packed so tightly they could barely move, each clutching his rifle, each thinking about the ramp in front of them. Some whispered prayers, others stared at the small crack of light above the steel door. The sound of waves, the crash of shells, and the metallic thud of bullets hitting water filled the air. They knew the first seconds after that ramp dropped would decide everything. Fear moved like electricity through the ranks. The coxswain could feel it, even without seeing their faces. He was alone at the rear, guiding a fragile craft through an ocean of death, knowing that every decision he made could end 30 lives or save them. In training, dropping the ramp had been mechanical, a routine maneuver. But here, every heartbeat between decision and death was magnified. The soldiers trusted him completely, though they never spoke. He was just the Navy guy steering the boat. Yet his hands, trembling on the throttle, carried the weight of 30 souls. That unspoken bond, one man at the helm, 30 men waiting for his signal, became one of the quietest, most powerful dynamics of the invasion. The tactical angle gives the moment sharper meaning. The entire success of the landing depended on timing. Each boat had a precise schedule, an assigned sector, and a sequence. But the sea didn't care about plans. Strong cross-currents dragged boats away from their targets, waves forced coxswains to overshoot, and smoke obscured landmarks. A few seconds' delay meant landing in the wrong place, under the wrong gun. The decision of when to lower the ramp was the final link in a broken chain of command. Military doctrine said to drop when the boat grounded, when the bottom scraped sand. But on Omaha, grounding often meant exposure. Many boats hit sandbars 200 yards out, forcing men to wade through deep water. Others pushed too far and got stuck, blocking the next wave behind them. The chaos multiplied with each landing. In those conditions, the coxswain's decision to drop early wasn't just reckless, it was tactically radical. It broke every rule, yet achieved what the rules couldn't: survival. From the technological angle, the Higgins boat itself shaped the outcome. It was one of the simplest, most effective designs in the war. A flat-bottomed craft made of plywood and steel, with a retractable ramp that turned transport into assault. It could carry 36 men, a jeep, or a small load of supplies. It was cheap, fast, and easily produced. But it was never meant to withstand sustained fire. Its armor was thin, barely enough to stop small fragments. A burst from an MG-42 could cut through both sides in seconds. The ramp, though ingenious in design, became a death trap under machine gun fire. The Germans had studied Allied landings in Sicily and Salerno. They knew the ramp would drop first, and they aimed directly at it. On Omaha, their gunners were waiting. As each ramp fell, the first row of soldiers became instant silhouettes. The Higgins boat gave mobility, but at a terrible cost. Every coxswain understood this weakness. Every one of them had seen other boats ahead disintegrate. Yet most still followed procedure, pushing as close as possible. The young coxswain in our story saw what the design could not protect against, and he adapted. His early drop turned the ramp from a target into a shield. Then there was the invisible angle, fear and training fighting for control. These men had rehearsed this landing again and again. They knew their places, their commands, their objectives. But no training could reproduce the shock of real battle, the smell of burning oil, the screams, the blood in the surf. Under that kind of stress, the human brain narrows its focus. Some froze. Some followed orders blindly. A few, like the Coxswain, broke through instinct and saw the truth. The plan no longer fit the reality. In every war, doctrine meets experience. On Omaha Beach, that meeting was brutal. The soldiers expected support, coordination, and precision. What they found was chaos, confusion, and death. The coxswain's act may have looked impulsive, even cowardly, but in the logic of battle, it was clarity, the kind that comes only when survival overrides obedience. When the ramp splashed into the sea, 30 men leapt into freezing water instead of running into open fire. Some stumbled, some went under, but they lived. Their gear dragged them down, their rifles floated away, yet when they reached the sand, they found cover among obstacles. Alive, dazed, but alive. The ramp behind them, still raised, bore the scars of what would have been their deaths. In that moment, the boundaries between leadership and instinct dissolved. The war that was supposed to be fought by generals and plans was instead decided by a single man's split-second decision. And across Omaha Beach, hundreds of others would face the same impossible choices before the day was done. From the German side of the bluffs, Omaha Beach looked like a stage set for destruction. In the pre-dawn light, the soldiers of the 352nd Infantry Division had watched the armada draw closer, a horizon filled with ships. They waited in bunkers, their MG-42s mounted on tripods, ammunition belts laid out in neat coils. Each team had a clear sector of fire, overlapping with its neighbors. Every range was pre-measured, every approach zeroed in. From their perspective, the first wave wasn't men but shadows in boats, barely visible through smoke and mist. But as soon as the ramps dropped, those shadows became targets. The German gunners were relentless. The MG-42's rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute, meant that no ramp could fall without being hit. For the defenders, it was mechanical. For the men inside, it was annihilation. The enemy's angle exposes a brutal truth of D-Day. The Germans were not caught unprepared. Though Allied deception operations had confused their high command about the exact landing site, the local defenders were disciplined, well-trained, and perfectly positioned. Their commanders had built defenses designed specifically to exploit the landing craft's weakness. The MG-42s, firing from concealed embrasures, targeted the lower arcs of approach, where the boats would slow to land. They aimed not for individuals, but for the ramp line itself. Each boat that came within range was greeted by the same mechanical rhythm of death. The German gunners saw the ramp fall, the front rank disappear, and the next boat come forward. They kept firing. It was not cruelty. It was their duty. This was the storm the coxswain faced. He saw the pattern long before others did. He saw where every ramp fell and where every burst of tracers struck next. His eyes followed the rhythm. Boat, ramp, fire, silence. He didn't see enemies. He saw inevitability. And he knew that in seconds it would be his turn. That clarity, under unimaginable pressure, was the dividing line between obedience and survival. Then came the leadership angle, the heart of the story. Leadership on D-Day was not always about commanding from maps or shouting orders across radio. It often came down to one person's instinct in the face of chaos. The coxswain's decision to drop early was not planned or sanctioned. It broke procedure and violated every instruction he'd been given. Yet, at that moment, leadership meant something different. Seeing what others could not, and acting when hesitation meant death. The men in the boat didn't understand what he'd done until later. To them, the early drop felt like failure. Fear disguised as haste. But when the bullets ripped through the air where the ramp would have been, the truth revealed itself. Leadership, in that instant, wasn't about commanding others. It was about protecting them without their understanding. The coxswain led without words, through instinct, through courage, unrecognized. This form of leadership repeated itself across Omaha that morning. Junior officers, sergeants, engineers, medics all found themselves making impossible decisions. The carefully drawn lines of authority dissolved in the smoke. Men acted because waiting meant dying. In that sense, the coxswain's act wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger pattern of spontaneous, desperate leadership that kept the invasion from collapsing in its first hour. The moral angle deepens the story further. War is built on obedience, the chain of command, the discipline that turns chaos into order. But at what point does obedience become fatal? The coxswain's decision forced that question into sharp focus. He had been trained to follow orders. But what if those orders led directly to death? What if saving lives required breaking them? The answer wasn't philosophical in that moment. It was immediate and visceral. He didn't weigh morality or defiance. He reacted to the truth before his eyes. After the battle, those who survived began to speak of men like him, small acts of disobedience that saved countless lives. Some officers dismissed them as luck or coincidence. Others quietly recognized the courage it took to act outside command. The line between cowardice and courage blurred in the smoke of Omaha Beach. The coxswain's action could have been career-ending if the outcome had been different, but history remembers what reports do not. The humanity behind decisions made in chaos. In war, survival often hinges on the smallest deviations. The coxswain didn't change the course of the invasion, but he changed everything for the 30 men in his boat. Some would later say that leadership is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. On Omaha Beach, mastery took the shape of a single desperate pull of a lever, one man's refusal to surrender to a doomed plan. From a distance, the landing looked like an organized operation. From within, it was fragments of bravery pieced together by instinct. The coxswain's decision stands among those fragments, a symbol of what the invasion truly demanded. It was not perfect obedience that won the beach, but courage born from chaos. That day, amid explosions, gunfire, and confusion, each soldier discovered his own measure of leadership. For some, it meant charging forward through machine gun fire. For others, it meant crawling inch by inch through the surf. For one sailor, Steering a fragile boat into hell, it meant breaking the very rule that defined his duty. And as the battle intensified, those small acts, multiplied across every sector of Omaha, began to shift the tide. The invasion would not fail. But first, it would pass through its darkest hour. The moment of decision came not with a shout or command, but with silence, the kind that precedes disaster. The boat was closing fast on the shore. The men inside crouched lower, clutching their rifles as water sprayed through bullet holes in the steel hull. The coxswain's eyes locked on the beach ahead. Gray sand, barbed wire, concrete bunkers flashing with muzzle bursts. He saw the arcs of MG-42 tracers slicing downward into the surf, saw other boats ahead erupt into fire. One after another, their ramps dropped, and men fell before they could even take a step. His stomach tightened. Every instinct screamed to stop, but the orders were burned into his mind. Get them close, drop the ramp, keep the sequence moving. Behind him, the sea roared with engines and explosions. Around him, the air was a storm of shrapnel. His hands clenched the throttle as he felt the hull scrape something beneath. A sandbar, maybe 50 yards too soon. It was too far from shore. According to every rule, he should have powered through, but rules didn't matter anymore. He glanced toward the bluffs. The tracers were moving, cutting through the exact line his boat was about to enter. He could see where they hit, the line of death sweeping horizontally just above the water. Another ramp fell. The first row of soldiers vanished into spray and red mist. His jaw locked. He knew what was coming for them next. Without thinking, he pulled the lever. The metallic crash of the ramp dropping was lost in the roar of gunfire. The soldiers inside shouted in confusion, some cursing, some frozen. They had expected to hit sand. Instead, icy water surged over the ramp and flooded in. The first men tumbled forward, swallowed by the surf. Panic rippled through the ranks. But as they fell, the bullets that had been tracking their position tore through empty air, striking the ramp itself instead of flesh. The coxswain's heart pounded. He saw what the men couldn't. The storm of tracers ricocheting off the steel door, sparks spraying in every direction. He shouted for them to go, to jump, to move. One by one they leapt into the freezing water, weighed down by packs and rifles. Some went under and didn't rise immediately. Others kicked free, gasping, pulling themselves forward through chest-deep surf. Every second felt endless. Then came the realization. The ramp, his mistake, his defiance, had shielded them. The bullets struck where their bodies would have been. The ramp was riddled with holes, shuddering under the impact. But behind it, the 30 men he carried were alive. They struggled and crawled, half swimming, half wading toward the beach obstacles that dotted the tide line. A few were hit in the water, but most reached the relative cover of the metal hedgehogs and wooden stakes. He stayed at the helm, shouting, waving others forward. His own survival was uncertain. The next round could easily find him, but his focus never wavered. The boat rocked violently as a mortar exploded nearby, showering fragments across the deck. One fragment struck his shoulder. He gritted his teeth and pressed on. The ramp hung half open, splintered and smoking, but it had done its job. From the beach, chaos reigned. The first waves were pinned down, lying flat against the sand as bullets whistled overhead. Engineers struggled to clear obstacles. Officers were dead or scattered. But slowly, small groups began to move. Men who had somehow made it through the water alive. Many of them came from boats like his. Their survival became the nucleus of progress, tiny footholds forming under impossible conditions. As the tide shifted, the coxswain finally reversed the engine. He knew he couldn't stay. The boat was taking water, riddled with holes, the engine sputtering. He turned to look one last time. The beach was still chaos. Smoke, fire, bodies, the deafening echo of machine guns. Yet among that horror, he saw movement. Those same men he had carried, crawling forward, using beach obstacles as shields, alive because of a decision that should have ended his career. He didn't think of glory or consequence. He thought only of the faces that had vanished under the water and then reappeared. He thought of how close they had come to dying inside that boat, trapped like the others he'd seen. The fear that had gripped him minutes earlier was replaced by something else: quiet disbelief. He had acted against everything he was taught, and it had worked. For those men, that single act became the line between life and death. For him, it was a moment that would never leave him. The boat limped back toward the sea, its engine coughing smoke, its sides pocked with holes. The coxswain's arm was bleeding, his hands shaking, but his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. He had more men to bring in, more landings to attempt. The invasion didn't pause for miracles. The day was far from over. The tide kept rising. The next wave was already on its way, and the men he'd saved were still fighting for every inch of that beach. The beach was a nightmare painted in gray smoke and shattered bodies. The surf ran red, waves lapping over helmets and rifles. Every few seconds, the concussive thump of German mortars shook the sand, followed by the endless staccato of MG-42s raking the shore. The coxswain's boat drifted backward, its engine sputtering and coughing black smoke. The smell of burning oil hung thick in the air. He could hear men screaming from nearby boats, some overturned, some drifting aimlessly, their crews gone. He looked toward the bluffs again. It was impossible to believe anyone could survive crossing that strip of sand. Yet through the haze, he saw movement. Small groups of soldiers, the ones he'd dropped early, were crawling forward. They ducked behind obstacles, dug into shallow craters, and fired upward in bursts. They weren't advancing far, but they were alive, and that meant everything. Then came the voice over the radio, broken, panicked, half-drowned by static. "We're pinned down. No movement. Everything's gone wrong." The command ships offshore were demanding updates, coordinates, numbers, but there were no numbers left to jing. Eve. The coxswain gripped the microphone, hesitated, then let it fall. What could he say? That the plan had disintegrated before it even began? That courage alone was keeping the beach alive? Another explosion rocked the boat, slamming him to the deck. He looked down and saw a jagged hole where a mortar fragment had punched through the steel. Water gushed in. For a moment he considered abandoning ship, just diving into the cold surf and swimming back to safety. But then he remembered the next wave coming in behind him. If they landed where the others had, if they went too close again, they'd be slaughtered. Someone had to stop them. He pushed himself up, blood dripping down his arm, and grabbed a red signal flag. Waving frantically, he stood in the open, shouting toward the next boat approaching fast. The crew stared in confusion. He pointed to the water, gesturing wildly, motioning for them to drop early, far from shore. At first they hesitated, unsure if he was signaling or losing his mind. Then a burst of tracers swept past, striking between them. The message became clear. The next boat dropped its ramp short. The men splashed out, confused, angry, but alive. That moment spread like wildfire across the sector. One coxswain after another, watching the slaughter ahead, began to follow suit. Ramps started dropping farther out. The sea filled with men struggling through waist-deep water, but fewer died at the ramp. The chaos was still immense, but now there was a rhythm to it. Brutal, slow, and human. Decisions were being made not by commanders offshore, but by those staring death in the face 20 yards from hell. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. The tide rose higher, washing away the wounded and the dead alike. The sand became a churn of mud and blood, yet somehow, against all logic, The survivors were pushing forward. Engineers crawled toward the obstacles, planting charges to clear paths. Riflemen used the smoke as cover, inching closer to the seawall. The air reeked of cordite and salt. The sound of bullets ricocheting off metal was constant, like rain on a roof. The coxswain finally managed to beach what was left of his boat. He joined a group of men huddled behind a twisted iron hedgehog. He was no longer a sailor, just another body in the fight. The sand burned under his hands as he crawled, each movement deliberate, each breath a gamble. He saw a sergeant ahead waving others forward, rallying them through sheer will. "Move! Keep going!" the man shouted, voice cracking from exhaustion. And they did. Inch by inch, men who had no reason to live kept advancing. By mid-morning, the tide of the battle began to shift. Naval guns pounded the cliffs, sending showers of earth and debris down over the German positions. Smoke thickened, blotting out the sky. In the confusion, small groups of Americans reached the base of the bluffs. Grenades arced upward. The coxswain lifted his head just in time to see one bunker fall silent, its machine gun finally stilled. For the first time all morning, there was a flicker of hope. Not victory. Not yet. But survival. He looked back toward the water. The sea that had been filled with bodies now teemed with motion. Reinforcements arriving, medics hauling the wounded, officers waving men toward new landing points. The once clear formation of the invasion had turned into organized chaos, but it was working. The beach was being taken, not by strategy, but by adaptation, courage, and raw human instinct. As the sun climbed higher, the coxswain leaned against a shattered obstacle, chest heaving. The air was heavy with smoke, his vision blurred from exhaustion. Around him, men moved like ghosts, faces streaked with grime and salt. None spoke much. There were no speeches, no cheering, just the dull, relentless push forward. He knew what would come next, the climb up the cliffs, the battle inland, the long, bloody road through France. But in that moment, as the guns thundered and the tide crept up to erase the scars of the morning, one truth remained. He had made the right choice. Not by command, not by training, but by instinct. The kind that separates survival from slaughter. By late morning, the beach had transformed from a slaughterhouse into a desperate foothold. Smoke rolled over the surf like a living thing, and the cries of the wounded mixed with the heavy thud of naval bombardment. The coxswain crouched low, salt water dripping from his helmet, his hands trembling from cold and adrenaline. Around him the air was thick with grit, sand thrown up by machine gun fire, pulverized rock, and the acrid bite of cordite. Every sense was overwhelmed. The tide was now halfway up the sand, carrying rifles, broken gear, and bodies back toward the sea. But among the chaos, small victories began to emerge. He watched as a squad finally reached the base of the bluff, using a crater for cover. They fired upward, exchanging bursts with Germans, still dug in behind their guns. Above them, a pillbox that had haunted the beach since dawn now spewed only smoke, the result of a lucky grenade or a direct naval hit. One less gun, tearing the shoreline apart. The coxswain had no weapon now, only a pistol that had jammed hours ago. Still, he kept moving, dragging the wounded toward cover when he could, waving fresh troops toward safer routes when the ramps dropped too close. He knew every inch of that deadly strip by now, where the sand dipped, where the next obstacle offered shelter. The instinct that had made him drop the ramp early now kept him alive, moment to moment. At one point, he saw a new wave of boats approaching. Most were coming in too close again, unaware of what waited near the surf. He climbed atop a rusted hedgehog and waved his arms, shouting himself hoarse. A few coxswains noticed. They cut speed, dropping men farther out, just like he had. Others didn't. The machine guns found them instantly. The sea erupted in splashes and screams, and he could do nothing but watch. Further down the beach, engineers worked furiously to clear lanes through Teal. He mined obstacles. They used Bangalore torpedoes, long metal pipes packed with explosives. The coxswain felt the ground tremble as one detonated nearby, sending a shockwave through the air. Sand and debris rained down, but the path was open. Through that smoking gap, infantry began to pour forward. By midday, the tide of men on Omaha Beach, scattered, leaderless, half-drowned, began to turn into a fighting force again. Officers who survived started organizing, rallying soldiers under whatever cover they could find. Radios crackled with fragmented orders. "Advance to the bluff! Take out that nest!" Each small move forward was paid in blood. The coxswain found himself next to a group of rangers regrouping at the base of a low dune. Their faces were gray with exhaustion, but their eyes burned with focus. One of them looked at him and nodded. No words, just understanding. They were all part of the same impossible push now. A sudden whine filled the air, the sound of an incoming shell. He dove flat as it exploded nearby, the blast throwing sand over him. When he lifted his head, he saw the remains of another landing craft ripped apart, pieces still falling into the surf. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the entire world was noise and fire. Then, through it all, came a sound he hadn't expected. Shouting. Not panic, but orders. Urgent, steady, human. The Americans were moving, crawling, running, falling, getting up again. Every step gained another yard of beach. Behind them, the smoke hid their progress from the Germans, and the naval guns began striking higher up the cliffs, giving the attackers a narrow chance to breathe. The coxswain crawled beside them, his knees sinking into wet sand. He could barely feel his legs anymore. Ahead, he saw a crater where a squad had taken shelter. Inside lay a wounded lieutenant, blood soaking through his sleeve. "Keep them moving," the officer whispered to anyone who could hear. And somehow they did. When they reached the base of the cliffs, the men began to climb. Rope ladders, bare hands, anything that could hold weight. The coxswain stared up, watching them disappear into the smoke. Every instinct told him this was madness. But it was working. The machine gun fire from above began to falter, replaced by bursts of rifle fire at closer range. The battle had shifted from the beach to the heights. He sank to his knees, too spent to move further. The sand was warm under the midday sun now, and the sound of the surf blended with the distant clash of small arms fire up the slope. For the first time, the sky above Omaha was no longer dominated by death. It was just sky. Somewhere offshore, the naval guns fell silent, replaced by the low rumble of engines bringing in supplies, medics, and more men. The invasion had not gone to plan, but it had not failed. Against all odds, the beach was being held. The coxswain looked down at his trembling hands, still slick with seawater and blood. Around him, the wounded were being pulled to safety, medics shouting for bandages and morphine. He could hear someone laughing, a broken, delirious sound, but louder nonetheless. They had survived what should have been impossible. He closed his eyes for a moment, hearing again that voice from earlier in the morning, the one that had screamed at him to stay in the boat. He could still see their faces, the men who'd looked at him in disbelief when he dropped the ramp early. Many of them were alive now, scattered up the beach or somewhere on the cliffs, and that was enough. The tide reached his boots, gentle, almost calm now. The same sea that had brought them to hell was beginning to wash it clean. The battle for Omaha was far from over, but the worst was behind them. By the afternoon of June 6th, Omaha Beach was unrecognizable. The tide had swallowed much of the morning's horror, leaving debris scattered across the shoreline, helmets, rifles, shattered landing craft. Smoke drifted lazily in the wind, mixing with the low groans of wounded men waiting for medics who never stopped moving. For those who survived, the air still tasted of gunpowder and salt. The battle had slowed, but the fear lingered in every heartbeat. The coxswain stood beside what was left of his boat. The bow was split open, half submerged in the tide. He leaned against it, exhausted, the adrenaline long gone. Around him, soldiers trudged past in silence, moving toward the bluffs they had finally claimed. Every few minutes, another shell fell somewhere inland, echoing like distant thunder. The invasion, the greatest in history, had succeeded, but the price was almost beyond comprehension. He watched as stretchers lined the beach. Corpsmen worked tirelessly, their uniforms darkened with blood and seawater. Names were called out, checked against rosters that no longer matched reality. Dozens of men were listed as missing, though everyone knew what that meant. Others lay wrapped in blankets, waiting for boats to take them back to the ships offshore. The sound of engines replaced the machine guns now, a reminder that the day's mission had changed from landing to survival. Nearby, a group of engineers cleared obstacles still jutting from the sand. They worked quietly, eyes averted from the bodies tangled in barbed wire. The tide had carried some of the dead away, but many remained where they had fallen, young faces barely distinguishable beneath grime and water. The coxswain tried not to look too long. Offshore, the horizon was dotted with the silhouettes of hundreds of ships. The sheer scale of it was staggering, a floating city that had delivered an army to the shore. Landing craft still moved back and forth, ferrying the wounded, bringing supplies, carrying messages that no radio could bear. For every boat that returned, another took its place. The invasion was alive, relentless, unstoppable now. Officers walked among the men, voices low and steady. They spoke of objectives, roads to secure, villages to reach, bridges to hold. The war machine was already turning forward. Yet beneath the discipline, the human cost hung heavy. Everyone on that beach knew they had lived through something no plan could have predicted. The coxswain finally sat down on a piece of twisted steel, the remains of a ramp torn from his craft. He ran his hand across the cold metal, remembering how it had dropped hours earlier, how that one decision had changed everything. Around him, other coxswains were talking quietly, comparing notes, sharing disbelief at what they had seen. Some wept. Others stared at nothing. Each of them had faced the same impossible choice: obey orders or follow instinct. And not all had chosen the same way. Reports later that day would tell of sectors nearly wiped out, of units scattered and leaderless. Yet somehow, through sheer chaos and courage, the beachhead had been taken. Historians would later write of tactical errors and logistical missteps. They would talk of tide tables, misjudged bombardments, and misplaced troops. But none of that captured what the men remembered. The smell of wet sand, the scream of bullets skipping off the waves, the moment when survival depended not on orders, but on a heartbeat's decision. As the sun began to dip toward the west, the coxswain looked inland. The hills were scarred with craters and smoke columns. Tanks were beginning to move through the cleared gaps, tracks, grinding over what had once been impossible ground. Behind them, men marched slowly, weapons slung, eyes hollow but determined. The invasion was moving on. He stood, feeling the ache in his legs and the burn of salt on his skin. The beach he had landed on at dawn was gone now, transformed into a military base, a logistics hub, a cemetery. Every inch of it had been bought with human lives. He knew he would leave soon, called back to the ship for resupply or orders. But part of him would never leave this place. He turned once more to the sea. The same waves that had carried him toward death now reflected the setting sun, calm and golden. For a fleeting moment, It looked peaceful again, as if the ocean had already forgotten the screams that had echoed over it. But the men who stood there knew better. The day had ended in victory, but no one felt victorious, only grateful and hollow. The following morning would bring new landings, new pushes inland, new names written into history. Yet the memory of that first wave, of those who stayed in the boat and those who didn't, would linger forever on the sand of Omaha. When dawn broke on June 7th, the sea was calm again. The horizon glowed faintly pink, and gulls wheeled silently over a coastline that had changed forever. The tide had erased most of the blood and chaos from the previous day, but not the memory. Everywhere the coxswain looked, the beach was covered in wreckage. Mangled landing craft, burned-out jeeps, twisted steel, and helmets lying half-buried in wet sand. The air smelled faintly of smoke and oil, a reminder that war was still close. The beach was alive with quiet movement. Medics carried the wounded toward evacuation boats. Engineers built makeshift roads over the sand using wooden planks and crushed stone. Graves registration teams worked in silence, marking rows with small white stakes and handwritten tags. Some of the soldiers paused as they passed, helmets in hand, giving quick, wordless salutes to friends who had fallen only a few feet from safety. The coxswain helped where he could. His arms ached from the previous day, his ears still ringing from the gunfire, but he refused to rest. He carried crates of ammunition off the beach, guided new boats through the shallows, and spoke briefly with men who had just landed. Their faces were tense, but they hadn't yet seen what Omaha had been 12 hours earlier. He didn't tell them. Some things couldn't be explained. They had to be lived. Around noon, he stood near a field hospital set up behind the dunes. The tents flapped softly in the wind, the smell of antiseptic strong enough to sting the nose. Inside, doctors worked without pause, their hands moving through a blur of bandages and blood. The moans of the injured carried across the sand like a low, endless tide. A chaplain knelt beside a stretcher, whispering prayers over a man who no longer moved. War had no silence, only pauses between the noise. News began to spread through the beachhead that the Americans had broken through the German defenses inland. The bluffs overlooking Omaha were now in Allied hands, and patrols had reached the first villages of Normandy. The impossible had become reality. Omaha, once thought lost, was secure. Yet for every report of progress came the names of those who hadn't made it. The cost was written not in strategy or statistics, but in the faces of men staring out to sea, unable to believe they were still alive. Later that afternoon, the coxswain was summoned to a briefing tent near the shoreline. A Navy officer was collecting after-action reports from surviving landing craft crews. When his turn came, the coxswain stood awkwardly, helmet under his arm, and explained what had happened. How he had dropped the ramp early, how it had saved lives, how others followed after seeing the carnage ahead. The officer listened in silence, taking notes on a damp clipboard. When he finished, there was no reprimand, no praise, just a nod and a quiet, "Thank you, sailor." That was all. Afterward, he walked down to the water's edge. The tide was low again, the sand streaked with patterns left by the receding waves. The same spot where he'd made his decision now lay calm and empty. He could almost hear the echoes of that moment, the shouting, the fear, the instant when instinct had overcome command. He wondered if anyone would ever know what truly happened in those first chaotic minutes. Most of the men who had seen it firsthand were already gone. He picked up a piece of shrapnel from the sand, jagged, rusted, still faintly warm from the sun. He turned it over in his hand, feeling its rough edges. It wasn't a souvenir. It was a reminder. A fragment of the day the sea turned red, and courage meant breaking the rules. Behind him, the rumble of tanks grew louder as the advance inland continued. Trucks rolled up the beach, carrying supplies, ammunition, and men toward the front. The war was moving on, stretching farther into France, but for the coxswain and those who had survived, Omaha, the first battle would never really end. It would replay itself in dreams, in the crash of waves, in the sudden silence that followed explosions. He looked out one last time toward the open water, the same channel they had crossed before dawn. The sunlight reflected off the waves like shards of glass. For a brief moment he allowed himself to feel pride, not for victory but for survival, for doing what had to be done when everything was falling apart. He turned and walked inland, away from the beach that had nearly taken him, toward the sound of engines and the next chapter of the war. The tide came in behind him, slow and steady, washing over the sand once more, carrying away the last traces of that terrible, defining day. History would come to know Omaha Beach as one of the bloodiest landings in modern warfare. The numbers alone could never capture what happened there. The confusion, the courage, the fear that bound men together in the face of certain death. Reports and maps would later define it as a tactical success carved from near disaster. But for those who lived it, the memory was not about victory or defeat. It was about survival. For the coxswain, that day became a ghost that followed him long after the war ended. In every sound of crashing surf, he could still hear the bullets striking water. In every flash of lightning, the muzzle flare of an MG-42. He had been trained to follow orders, but in that moment, obedience would have meant death. His choice to drop the ramp early, to defy the script of war, had saved lives. Yet it was a decision he would never boast about. It belonged to the men who ran into the water and kept going, those who never looked back. In the years that followed, historians would analyze the invasion, dissect the errors and the triumphs, and assign blame or brilliance to strategies drawn on paper. But what happened on that beach could never truly be written. It was born in the chaos of men acting on instinct, courage, and fear, human moments that no plan could predict. Omaha taught a lesson that echoed through every battle that followed, that war is never neat, never precise, and sometimes salvation comes from disobedience. The coxswain's act wasn't rebellion. It was clarity in the midst of madness, the rare moment when one man's instinct outweighed every order shouted over the radio. When he finally left the service, he never spoke much about what happened. But those who knew him said that every year, on June 6th, he'd drive to the coast, stand at the water's edge, and stare at the horizon in silence. The waves kept their rhythm, the same as that morning in 1944. He never stayed long, just enough to remember the day he dropped the ramp too soon, and in doing so, saved 30 men from a sea of fire.